some of the milk brands, some of the cooking oil brands all falsify, claiming that they have nutrition value where in fact they don't have any. It's a cleansing movement on IP and on originality of the products to make sure that we are not selling fake and counterfeit products, and especially to prove that we are not transshipment hub of China to the world.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Hey, Valerie, good to see you.
Hi, Jeremy. Good to see you.
Well, it's been a while, but glad to see and discuss about Vietnam and Southeast Asia. I think a lot has happened over the past few months, especially with the kind of like Trump tariffs, the pause of it, the current negotiation, but also the Vietnamese economy and the Southeast Asia. So I think it'll be interesting, robust debate to have. So Valerie, why don't you tell me like at a high level, what's happening with Vietnam today? From your perspective?
Yeah, from a high level, I think it's a bit hard to summarize everything going on at the same time. But you can look at Vietnam as we are going through a major economic and political transformations and reform. And this is the biggest reform since 1986, like since our first Đổi mới reform. This is our second biggest reform, not in terms of just economic, but also like political. So the recording I mentioned that we have, lay off public workforce and also like merging a lot of provinces. So we finished the project. Officially, we only have like 34 provinces now. So we merged the provinces to have. And now we are moving on to like economic reform. So we revamped the export-driven economic model to domestic-driven economic model driven by technology. And I think that's where like venture capitals and also tech founders can play a major role into this reform. It's just like one aspect of what's happening in the past 3 months. I can maybe summarize a bit more. But, Jeremy, you remember 3 years ago, we arrested a few real estate and conglomerate leaders. One of them even had a death sentence. But actually in the past 1 month, we start to kind of release all of them. So the CEO of Tân Hoa Minh Real Estate Group, the CEO of FLC Group are, all kind of being forgiven. And also, if you remember, Madam Trương Mỹ Lan, I think her death penalty sentence is also scrapped, and very high chance that she might be out within this year. And all of them are contributing a lot of money to the central government. So it's sort of like a reverse anti-corruption campaign. And we realized the critical mission of these very successful businessmen and women to the economy, especially in this very vulnerable state of the Vietnamese economy. So we have to release this wonderful entrepreneurs and help them to help our economy in this very, vulnerable state of economy.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. What was interesting was that, we talked about the Burning Furnace anti-corruption campaign, right? And at that point of time, it was a huge push with over 30,000 individuals being investigated, over 16,000 investigations. And then obviously it caught a lot of small fish, big fish. And then after that, we had the settlement of the political, right, with the transition of the leadership for Vietnam. And then now we have this economic weakness period driven by the Trump tariffs policy. And so now it's interesting here, you describe it as the reverse anti-corruption campaign. And I think it's interesting because I think this is a little bit similar to the China dynamic, right, where we had a lot of entrepreneurs who were very silent. For example, the most famous being Jack Ma at Alibaba. He was very much silenced and was kept quiet for some period of time. And now he's back now that, to kind of hopefully transform Alibaba, but also kind of keep pushing the economy as well. So I think there's some interesting parallels there.
Yeah, definitely. There's parallel, and I think we also learned from China on this resolution 68 that is forcing Vietnam to be more like technology driven, so that we can become like high developed countries and escape from the middle class middle income trap. But in the process, we are still getting very under a lot of stress in the negotiation with US regarding the tariff. So I think we just finished the meetings, third official meetings for the negotiation of the tariff. And the exact number was not disclosed, but both sides have been saying that most of the major concerns are already like resolved, but there's still 1 or 2 points that we haven't come to an agreement. And that's why they could not disclose the final number for the tariff, but they have gone to like third meetings, like official meetings already. For my intels, the US side have asked a lot of difficult and very tough questions and also demands from not just like military support from the US, like Vietnam starting to buy F-16 from the US, but also like forcing Vietnam to cleanse and kind of clean out the domestic commercials and trade, so that we can prove that we have like transparency, where the goods coming from. We are not being a transshipment hub, and we are not relying on Chinese for supplying suppliers for supply chain. So in addition to bigger news in the real estate development front, we also have a lot of small scale arrests and crackdown of like, you know, counterfeit products and also fake food products that are kind of very popular in Vietnam in the past few years. We also banned on the discount. Like previously, most of the merchants have like very steep discount of 80%. Now that practice is totally banned, and the highest percentage of discount that merchant can advertise is capped at. So honestly, the past 2 months is a lot of change, a lot of movements in the trade and commerce industry in Vietnam.
So I think a lot to dig into. I think maybe we'll start first with, I think, the macro, right? The start of it, which is that I think all of us felt like, okay, there's a burning furnace campaign, okay, and that caused some real estate, obviously, at the time, pricing instability, right, because of these incomplete projects. And as a political transition, which was relatively smooth, I think the big transition has really been this Liberation Day tariffs, right, which kind of like threatens the whole Vietnamese economic model, export orientation. Yeah. And obviously, check out our past episodes to discuss those impacts. But I think what's interesting is, I think that on reflection, it felt like all of my Vietnamese peers before the tariffs came to place were much more optimistic about what that starting position was, right? And then I think that very high Vietnamese tariff position that America had kind of like really surprised everybody. And now I think there's this negotiation phase that's quite difficult. So I think it sounds like there's like several pillars of it. So correct me if I'm wrong. So I think first of all, obviously, is there is a tariff structure on Vietnamese goods going to America. So I think that's one big pillar. The second big pillar is defense spending, which you and I know that they had already started taking action by buying Boeing and so forth. So military purchases from America. But the third thing that's interesting is actually quite interesting to me and new to me is the higher standards on, let's say, intellectual property, on transshipment. Could you share a little bit more about this third pillar?
Yeah, exactly. So I think the third pillar has pretty much shocked all the small business owners in Vietnam, because previously they can just buy like a lot of goods for cheap from China and not worry about clarifying where the origins of this product. But now, if they cannot prove where this goods coming from, they will be fined. And it's a very hefty fine as well. So a lot of small merchants would crack down, because now we have to prove like this is not a counterfeit products. We need to show like this have a clear IP, clear like shipment route. It's not coming from China, especially in the food standards. Like they also find out a lot of food products falsifyingly claim that they have like protein, they have a lot of nutrition in this product, but actually when they do like quality control, the product only has about 10% of what they claim that the product has. So that is some of the milk brands, some of the cooking oil brands, all falsify, claiming that they have nutrition value where in fact they don't have any. So it's a cleansing movement on IP and on originality of the products to make sure that we are not selling fake and counterfeit products, and especially to prove that we are not transshipment hub of China to the world.
No, I think it's interesting because this whole pillar is really much about, let's say, standards and practices, right? And personally, I also in Singapore, I read the news about the food safety scandal for oil, cooking oil, and the baby milk powder, right? And I thought that was interesting because the cooking one was basically they relabeled animal feed oil, which is not verified for human safety, and they relabel it as cooking oil. But more importantly, they relabel it as a current popular brand that's used by street food and restaurants and packaging, like packaged processed foods. So I thought it was interesting where they made hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Doing that, and then I'm like thinking to myself, oh man, I really enjoy my food in Vietnam. Did I eat some of this, animal feed oil? So I'm sure everybody in Vietnam must be pissed off.
Yep.
Yeah, because everyone's complaining, I'm sure, right?
I think unfortunately we might have all been eating some food that was cooked with animal fat oil.
So you and I definitely ate some.
Yes, I think so.
Like, so I think that's so I guess anybody who's eaten Vietnamese food over the past in Vietnam over the past couple of years probably had some percentage of it. Okay, 1% or some. And the other part that was interesting also the fake infant milk powder was actually very similar because I was in China back in 2000s and kind of like 8 around there, right? And that was also the fake milk powder was a big issue with the melamine protein poisoning case of children. So this is obviously different in the sense that they didn't inject a protein that kills kids. It's still a similar issue where there is the milk powder it doesn't have the ingredients like you say, right? It doesn't
have the nutrition.
There's a nutrition, which is horrible because you're giving your baby, and I think there's actually a fair point, right? Because we all know that infant formula is very expensive, right? Per 100 grams versus, standard cow milk powder, right? So I think there's that price arbitrage that you're using, taking advantage to relabel. But, I think it's kind of interesting because, I thought these food safety scandals, wouldn't the local police want to crack down on this? Why is it only coming out now versus like it could have happened like a year ago during the burning furnace anti-corruption scandal, for example?
I think a year ago, 1 year or 2 years ago, the burning furnace was only targeting like the big real estate guys. But today we are kind of cracking down the food safety because this is also for, the nutrition and safety of the entire country. But I think it's a consequence of where, when you try to fight counterfeit products of like shoes and bags and clothes, you also realize there's a lot of counterfeit goods in the food that Vietnamese consume every day. So in addition to the fake milk, there was also a candy brand that advertised that if you only eat one candy per day, you fulfill the whole vegetable required for the entire day. So it's like a vegetable candy. It's I think it's an alarming movement that the police sees and they decide to crack down like all at once because this is for our reputation, for our we are promising to US that we are showing our effort to protect IP, to cleansing out the domestic commercial and trade, and by promising and doing that, we realize not just goods have a counterfeit issue, but also food has an issue on the safety standards. So that's why I think the police doing everything at once right now.
So I think it's interesting because this is primarily a domestic food issue, right? I think that obviously gets a lot of headlines, both domestically and internationally. But of course, I don't think that is the thing that really satisfies America's request to dive into more into the transshipment side, as well as the country of origin stuff. That being said, I guess maybe weirdly an unintended positive benefit, I guess, of this tariff negotiation is a tightening of food safety practices in Vietnam. So, thanks, Trump, for improving the health of Vietnamese consumers.
Yeah, actually, we're also doing a lot to tightening the ports. So recently, our seaports and our airports, especially the major ports, they are all increasing the supplies of police in those ports. So before, you only need a few, I guess, commissioners to inspect the goods coming in the country. But now every single port, it's supplied with police, additional police to help with the quality control and transparency and traceability of these goods. So we are actually working on our promises and delivering what we have promised to the US, and not just, we don't just don't do anything.
I guess the most important issue for America is really the transshipment piece, right? Which is the last thing they want is a Chinese good to go into the Vietnamese port, get labeled as a Vietnamese product, and then go into America, labeled as a Vietnamese good. And I think that's quite important because they also raised tariffs on China dramatically, right? And so that increases the incentive for transshipment. So I think being able to crack down on this is going to be a key part of the strategy. I think what are the implications of this, right? So, I mean, I'm just saying, like, what's the silver lining? Like, if you're like a founder, maybe now's the time to build a bigger Vietnamese factory with Chinese labor and talent. So you're really really producing in Vietnam. That's one approach. Is it better for international MNCs competing in Vietnam because they don't have to fight against unfairly, inappropriately low-priced Vietnamese goods that were actually just Chinese goods without the same quality standards? I mean, I'm just kind of curious, like, what do you think are the implications you think for business and technology leaders?
Yeah, so I think for the bigger MNC, where their investment or FDI is in the range of like billions. So for them to actually like invest in more factories or warehouses in Vietnam, they need time. They need to see where this tariff negotiation is coming before they even put any commitment to build a warehouse or factory in Vietnam. So the sad reality is actually a lot of FDI in Vietnam is being on hold because they don't know, this MNC don't know where the negotiation is coming. So they put on hold of all of this like big investment. For the smaller like entrepreneurs or especially the people with like 200 or couple hundred millions to build local factories, I think a lot of them are like very serious on moving the supply chain entirely to Vietnam. But it's not the story that you can do immediately in 1 year because Vietnam is 15 to 20 years behind like China in terms of hardware supply chain. So if we want to, we would love to produce like iPhones or Samsung phone or everything from Vietnam and not relying on the chips or the components from China. But we cannot right now because we are still very far behind. So if I were these like entrepreneurs who have like couple hundred million to invest, I would actually jumping in right now to take the opportunity right now. I think, in fact, Shein just officially have a warehouse in Vietnam this past month.
Yeah, I think it's actually a good point that you have is that I think there was a lot of announcements last year about FDI, foreign direct investment, because everybody was really seeing a just China plus one strategy and China plus one being Vietnam, right? And so Vietnam could benefit from, Chinese components, there'll be assembly in Vietnam. But obviously, like I said, the one thing worse than a high tariff rate is the uncertainty over the tariff rate. And I think that makes a lot of sense, which is that, officially we can believe there's a lot of FDI, but unofficially, like you said, everything's going to be paused or slowed down until people sort it out. I think what's interesting is, the opportunities. So like you said, I think for those who are willing to come in and build factories in Vietnam, maybe a smaller scale, this could be a good time to negotiate, right? I guess with Vietnamese local partners because of the weakness. I think it's also interesting that you mentioned that, there's a bit of an effect where you're mentioning where the Vietnamese economy has a reorient from export to domestic via the Resolution 68. So why don't you talk to me about that? Because that sounds also a little bit similar to the Chinese push on moving a little bit more towards domestic consumption. But how big is it? How serious is it? Is it because Vietnam doesn't trust in the export orientation approach to America in case this happens again? Talk to me about that reorientation.
Yeah, so I think this reorientation is bound to be happen. When you only are assembling hub of the world, you don't have any power in terms of like IPs or technology. You don't have any proprietary technology. The strategy will be at risk when you no longer have labor, the young labor workforce that you used to have. And especially when this labor is becoming more and more expensive than 10, 20 years ago. If you look at the Vietnamese demography, we're actually getting older before we get richer. So 2030, when our golden population is no longer golden, because 2030 is when we start to age more than we have newborn. So this export oriented strategy is quite dangerous if one day, our labor workforce is no longer the young and, the low wage workforce that this model could work. So that's why Resolution 68 and last year, late last year, we have also Decree 58 that oriented Vietnam to a newer economic model. Before, own enterprise contribute like more than 50% to Vietnam GDP. But according to the Resolution 68, the government want to push more like private enterprise and private entrepreneurs to contribute more to the local GDP. So they want like entrepreneurs to build more and contribute more to the economy, especially like the conglomerates. And they want them to contribute like at least more than 50% to the economy instead of below 50%. As of today. So state-owned enterprise will become less, I would say still very important, but no longer the biggest contributor to the Vietnam GDP. So we encourage, entrepreneurs and business owners to be like the forefront of the building of Vietnam economy. So that's the main takeaway of Resolution 68. Decree 57, on the other hand, like really want to push Vietnam to be a high-tech nation. The government really pointed out like artificial intelligence and semiconductors and fintechs and big data, LLM, as the main industry that will drive and move Vietnam forward instead of traditional like exporting industries such as garment and textile. So those are the main points of, I would say, the biggest economic reform in Vietnam for the past 40 years.
Yeah, I mean, Resolution 68 sounds like a very big shift. I'm a Star Wars guy, so it reminds me of Execute Order 66. Emperor Palpatine's, order to the clone troopers against the Jedi. But yeah, so Resolution 68 sounds very, important. But I think the key thing here is, I think obviously it sounds like there's two parts, right? One is the orientation away from export to domestic, which is a big piece. And then secondly is improving the private sector, right? Versus, I guess, the state-owned versus government sectors. So that's important. Do you think it's serious? I think I think a lot of people sometimes feel like in Southeast Asia, for example, Gita Sahir talks about Indonesia. There's a lot of orders or resolutions about privatization, but there's a big gap between reality versus the kind of like the policy declaration announcement, right? So I'm just kind of curious from your perspective how you think about it.
Yeah, I think we cannot afford to be not serious. When you see the entire FDI of Q1 is on hold, and actually Vietnamese GDP growth a lot of it relies on FDI. And for the entire, I would say 3-4 months of the year, the entire FDI is on hold and you don't have any like new committed FDI. And the country is being like pressure on 8% GDP growth. You cannot afford to not being serious with economic reform. And that's why they release all the real estate tycoons from the prison.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because I think you previously mentioned in the past that the Vietnamese government is targeting 8% GDP growth, right? I think in the previous episode. I think last year was like about 7%. And what do you think this year is going to be? It's going to be lower than that, right? I guess because of the tariff and FDI. Maybe like 6 or 5%.
So the government is very ambitious and does not change its 8% target. But realistically, I think 5 to 6% is a more realistic number. But the government doesn't think so. Yeah, our prime minister is still firm on 8%. And, it's created a lot of stress. So the government also forced State Bank of Vietnam to increase credit and also, lower rates. The State Bank is also being asked to lend out money with zero interest to some projects, mostly like infrastructure project lending. The State Bank is forced to lend at 0%. And our loan debt to GDP ratio is quite high as of today. So we are under a lot of stress, I would say.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think if you are the macro government, forcing your domestic capital to deploy low interest rates to your own infrastructure, of course, it's better to get foreign capital like World Bank, etc., to do it. But if it's not available, you just have to get it done, right? So, and I think nobody would say that infrastructure in Vietnam is overbuilt yet, I would say.
Yeah,
so it's not like Japan. Like Japan would be like, okay, you want to build more highways, and I was just going to be like, don't really see the point of that. I think China's starting to get that point already, saturation point, to be like, okay, you better be careful about which infrastructure projects get 0% interest rate loans because, you may never get paid back. But I think definitely for Vietnam, I think a lot more infrastructure needs to be built. I mean, talk about the airports, the highways, the railways. There's so much that needs to be done.
Exactly.
On that note, I think looking ahead, what do you think are the most important milestones for Vietnam?
Yeah, I think we have to get this negotiation period to end at a strong note. So I would say if the outcome is 20% tariff, 10 to 20% tariff, it will be great because if you compare cost analysis, if Vietnam is only 10 to 20% tariff, it's still worth it to invest and build factories and build a manufacturing hub in Vietnam. So we have to get the tariff down to between 10 to 20%. So that's my KPI. Yeah.
So if it's 30%, then if
Yeah.
it's 20% maybe, and then 10% would be good.
I think so.
Yeah. Not an easy piece. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting because for me, when I hear all of that, I think the tariff is controllable to the extent of negotiation. I think the big milestone is whether Vietnam actually successfully executes on Resolution 68 because, I think the whole world cannot count on America as an export market anymore, right? And so I think the more painful thing is this Resolution 68, whether it truly executes. And, I think obviously debt to GDP, I'm a bit less worried about it. I mean, I think Vietnam is around, I think 33%. If I remember, Vietnam and Indonesia is currently around 40% right now for debt to GDP. Normally, you can get up to about 60%. Obviously, you don't want to do it in one go,
No.
or do it super fast. But I think both Vietnam and Indonesia have a lot of infrastructure to be built out. So for the right reasons, I think can be done. But I think that the shift to domestic consumption, if it's true, is also probably one of the biggest changes for people who want to be entrepreneurs, right, in Vietnam, right? Because I think historically you wanted to be building something that was for export, but now if you're willing to build something for domestic consumption, maybe that could work. But obviously it's going to be a big transition in mindset and also opportunity set as well.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think that slowly there's a big attitude shift in the government and the business community already. So we have a new national data center, and the governor inside the national data center is actively working with startups in Vietnam to help refining the data and also building the models for the national data centers. So that also allow entrepreneurs to openly getting data from the government without having to pay for it or having a lot of competition in who get the data. So I already see a positive, but I think Resolution 68 is a long-term project. We might not see immediate effect this quarter, but I think it's a 3-5 years kind of project. And right now I'm already seeing positive approach from the government by paying and partnering with startups for, the AI and data initiative.
Could you share with me what that positive benefit looks like?
Yeah, like I mentioned, all the startups now can access openly data from the government. Before, there's a lot of nuances, you have to pay, you have to bribe to get the data. Now it's a fair and open competition. If everyone can get data, it's the matter of who can train and develop models based on the same amount of data, and whoever can train it best and can build the best algorithm can win. So it's a very fair competition. Yeah, that's actually one of our portfolio companies doing recently.
Yeah, I think another business opportunity in my head I can imagine would be, looking at China as an example of if that shift truly happens. Some shifts that could also happen would be, well, the short term would be selling verified, obviously, baby milk powder. But also I think, in a broader sense, if you're able to build trusted domestic brands or Southeast Asian brands, I don't know, milk powder or food, assembled in Singapore, right, for Vietnam. But some sort of trust dynamic around food and safety. I can imagine something that could be an opportunity there.
Definitely.
Another opportunity I could think about would be maybe domestic tourism, right? I think that if you look at China, historically China, most of its tourism was foreign. And then after that shift towards domestic, I think there's a lot more domestic tourism, which was quite interesting. So I'm not sure if that would unlock for Vietnam.
I think so. Definitely. I think there will be a lot of more domestic brands that will be also born from this period of time. So I'm positive as well.
I guess maybe another type of company that could do well would be those, like traceability, kind of like startups, the country of origin verification. So if you're, I don't know whether that would be an American startup that already does traceability, or it could be a, Vietnamese company that does it in partnership with American side. But being able to do that, end-to-end verification that's respected by the Americans, but also by the EU, for like, audit, safety standards, that could be an interesting. Of course, it's a bit fragile, I think, because that kind of startup obviously is very dependent on, competing with local fakes. But what it reminds me of? It reminds me of that time. Remember 20, 30 years ago, it's like China was as known as the land of all the fake handbags, right? And then around the Olympic season, 2008, they started cracking down on like local fakes, handbags, counterfeit goods. And then now today, obviously, they still exist, but to a much smaller extent in China. And I think as a result, I think there's an emergence of like what I call like domestic Chinese mass premium brands, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like obviously they're not like super premium like Chanel or Hermes,
No,
right? But it's like those like the China equivalent of Tiffany's, right? Some sort of like which is it's premium or mildly premium, but it doesn't get competed away straight away by some counterfeit, right? And so I thought there was an emergence of that mild luxury Chinese goods. So I wonder if that could happen in Vietnam.
I think so. It's called the masstige movement, like mass and still prestige. So we already have some similar brands. I think we also learn a lot from those brands in China. A bag brand that I really like is Songmon. The pricing is kind of in the middle, and the quality is still feel very premium. So I bet on more and more of those masstige brands will appear in Vietnam.
Yeah. On that note, thanks so much, Valerie, for sharing. I think lots of business opportunities. And I think that hopefully the tariffs will land on a smaller number, closer to 10. But, maybe the next time we do this podcast, we'll find out what the number is and then we'll go from there. Yeah. Okay. All right. See you, Valerie.
See you.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.